Hey, good afternoon, everyone. If you're following along on the program, you probably noticed I'm not Diane Cowan. Diane's our Senior Vice President for Global Transit and had a travel snafu getting here from California yesterday. When she called me, I said probably should have taken the train. Then I remembered she was coming from California. So couldn't get to the airport. But anyway, I'm Harrison Wadsworth. I'm a Vice President for Government Relations at AECOM. And I'm based here in DC, and I've been working in rail and technology policy for about 15 years. And I'm excited to stand in for Diane this afternoon and moderate this panel. AECOM is the world's most trusted infrastructure consulting firm working to solve our most complex infrastructure challenges and build sustainable legacies for generations to come. We've got decades of experience in high-speed rail. We've got the honor of being the program management and delivery partner for California High-Speed Rail. And this panel is going to talk about how do we accelerate project delivery and draw on some of our global perspectives and experience with other projects around the world and bring best practices to the United States. So let's talk real quick about where we are, where we're going, and how we're going to get there fast. First, where we are, you all know this, we're behind the world with when it comes to high-speed rail. We're behind the UK, France, Germany, Japan. We're even behind Morocco now, which I looked up this morning, has a smaller GDP than any US state, yet they have a high-speed rail system. And all high-speed rail programs, all mega infrastructure projects face challenges, but there's some unique challenges to high-speed rail delivery that make focusing on best practices and accelerating program delivery all the more important. High-speed rail programs are complex, they're long-term, they transcend economic and political cycles. They generally require building greenfield infrastructure, new tracks, new electrification systems, new signaling and communication systems, new rolling stock, and they involve long distances, hundreds of miles, coordinating with numerous stakeholders. They cross many jurisdictions, towns, cities, counties, private property, states, and even national borders sometimes. And they involve working with other infrastructure owners like electric utilities, and they involve land acquisition, sometimes thousands of parcels. They require complex environmental approvals by multiple agencies at different levels of government. Not to mention the legal challenges that can slow down even the best planned projects. And as Brian Kelly mentioned earlier, sequencing is important. There's also workforce shortages in the country when it comes to high-speed rail. We don't have a network, so we don't have a lot of expertise in terms of human capital. Low unemployment right now, coupled with an aging workforce in the rail industry, puts pressure on agencies when it comes to delivery. There's competition for skilled workers, pushing up salaries and wages, and special expertise and tunneling and other aspects of design and construction can be hard to find. And across the economy, we're dealing with logistical and supply chain constraints, and those touch on high-speed rail as well. And perhaps most critically, we're dealing with funding constraints and the whims of political cycles that move faster than projects. It's very hard to plan long-term, large infrastructure programs when one can't really forecast funding opportunities beyond a few years. So where are we going? Despite all this, we know what works around the world and what can work here in the US. So the US High-Speed Rail Association's established a working group to study best practices around the world and bring them to this group here. And so while our experience in the US in delivering high-speed rail is limited, we can learn from some of these global experiences and best practices. So we're still putting together a report, but we wanted to share some of the early results. And that's what we're going to do now with some brief presentations. I'm now going to ask Eric Goldwyn to come up. Eric's an assistant professor and program director at the NYU Marin Institute for Urban Management. He recently completed a 3-year research project dealing the cost drivers of transit projects in the United States. And his team are actively working to translate those findings into policy changes at transit agencies and federal partners around the country. So, Eric?
Thank you very much. Let's see, does this work? Anyone? Anyone on this piece? Oh, there we go. All right. So as you can see, I'm a transit guy. What am I doing here? It's a great question. I think the fundamental premise is that U.S. transit costs are really high. High-speed rail costs are really high. Maybe there's something we can learn from looking at across the sector. No, maybe not. Well, I'll just talk. It's okay. So what I'll say is this. When I started doing the research, my team, we collected a database of about 900 projects across the world, 60 countries, and we found that the US was the sixth most expensive in the world. And then when you control for amount of, tunneling, elevated, that kind of thing, the US does much less tunneling than other parts of the world, but has much higher costs. So we found that, okay, the US is by far and away sort of building on a per mile, per kilometer basis, the most expensive projects in the world. So what I wanted to do was to look more deeply into the projects, right? So just having headline costs doesn't tell you all that much, other than it's expensive. And so we did very detailed cases in, I'm going to get it right now, in Istanbul, Stockholm, New York, Boston, and 4 cities in Italy. And the basic findings are that, wait, let's just see if, no, still doesn't work. All right. Is that in the US, the big drivers of costs have to do with sort of some of the governance issues that I've heard people talking about, a lot of interlocal relationships, those types of things. Physical structures and designs. Our stations are gigantic relative to what other people are doing. Also, project timelines, very long. The longer, oh, okay, use this one. Oh, is this the, was I using the wrong thing? Oh, look at that beautiful chart. This is the US over. Oh, I got it right. So happy. So yes, physical structures, labor, procurement, soft costs. Those are our 4 main drivers. And then just to give a sense of some of those physical structures. So for our phase 1 of the Second Avenue Subway project, station platforms about 600 feet long, station boxes 1,000 feet, 1,300 feet, 1,600 feet long, right? So you're talking about over 200% longer than the platform in some of those, in the last example. And then when we looked abroad, we saw 5%. 10%, maybe 20% longer than the platform. So very different. And then in other parts of the world, they have sort of modified cut and cover boxes that are even shorter than the platform. It's very interesting. I'd love to talk about it more sometime. And then this is a proposed station for Boston's Green Line extension that never got built because it was too expensive, so they had to reduce the scope. On the labor side of things, I don't know if anyone saw, there was a New York Times article several years ago about the most expensive mile of rail. And it was really about East Side access, but they also talked about Second Avenue Subway. And in that article, they sort of talked about, well, using that joke, how many people does it take to dig a tunnel? And they didn't really get very precise in the numbers. They were sort of like, it's this, it's that. So I was like, we're going to get precise in that number. The tunneling piece is not really the biggest thing, but what we found was when we compared the numbers to what we found in Spain and in Italy and in India, a couple other places, that we were overstaffing by about 50% on our projects. And my favorite stat from our New York City case study is that when they dug the launch box for the Second Avenue Subway, the TBM, it took 3 years. When they do it in pretty much every other part of the world that does it cheaply, 6 months to a year, right? So right there, you see a difference of 3x. And then when you take a labor cost, that's also 2 to 3x. We have a big overtime culture, those types of things. You end up understanding why things are 9 to 10 times more expensive. We talk a lot about procurement. I've heard people talking about it. I'm going to be very unpopular at this conference, I'm sure. We're big proponents of design, bid, build. We do think design, build can also work under certain circumstances. Less convinced of some of the other procurement methods that we examined in our cases. What I will say is I find that design, bid, build is often a throw the baby out with the bathwater situation rather than sort of it's ineffective. It's sort of things are going wrong. Let's just throw that out and start over again with something new. A big piece is the growing amount in soft costs. We talk a lot about the importance of in-house capacity and having agencies that understand their projects, can make decisions quickly, manage the change order process quickly. I see some people nodding, must be contractors who are unhappy. And so these are just our basic recommendations. Find some champions. Mainly, you need important elected officials to support you and not micromanage. They need to macromanage. They say, yes, this is important, then they get out of the way, that kind of thing. Bring in the experts from abroad. We have Mercedes here from Spain, so I'm very excited to hear what she has to say. Collaborate with those other partner agencies. The utility piece is a big delay, driver delay. I don't know if anyone has been following what's going on in Dallas with the Silver Line, but Nadine Lee just announced that the city of Dallas is costing her $100,000 a day, not giving her permits that they had agreed to only take 10 days to get, and she just was waiting 290 days. So you can do the math and figure out, what that delay costs. We're big proponents of staffing up, having that internal capacity, having the people at the agency that can actually do the job. And I can get more into that too. procurement, as I mentioned, design, bid, build is our big part of it. The other part of it is itemizing contracts. So there's transparency. It makes the change order process much, much easier and much, much faster, at least in our opinion. And then, we want to find standardizing of regulations, standardizing designs, all those types of things, and then limiting the contingencies. Contingencies in the US are quite large on projects that we looked at in the transit space. And we'll get into high-speed rail. And then with the stations, standardized design, cut and cover where you can, and build small. Those are the big things. That's all the time that I have. You can contact me here. And I did it.
Thanks, Eric. I'd now like to welcome Mercedes Sierra. Mercedes is the CEO of Center Engineering Systems. She's worked in both the public sector when she was in Spain and the private sector with her current firm, Center. She's got extensive expertise in managing complex projects across the globe in transportation and aerospace. She's served on boards and advisory committees, including for the US Department of Energy and the European Space Agency. And she's going to bring us a success story from Spain.
Thank you, Harrison, and thanks to the organization for having me as part of this excellent panel today. The presentation. Which is the good one? Okay, yeah. Okay, next slide, please. This one. Thank you. I'll start by saying that we at CENER are huge fans of high-speed rail, huge advocates, probably as most of the people in this room. We love it. We have built a core business around that, and we are involved in most of the ongoing high-speed rail programs around the world. But today I don't want to talk about CENER, but about the deployment of high-speed rail in Spain, which we consider really a success story. And why I'm saying this is a success story, first I would say because we have been able to build 2,500 miles of high-speed rail in about 30 years, and I would say for a very reasonable price. We have the second, and it has been so before, we have the second high-speed rail network in the world after China. Of course, China is 10 times bigger, but still we are number 2. But more important, I would say that high-speed rail has completely changed the way that people travel in Spain. I would even dare to say the way that people live in some cases, like living in some cities and working in Madrid or Barcelona or whatever. Around 75% of long-distance travels use high-speed rail in Spain, which, by the way, is very similar to what you have here with the Northeast Corridor, even if it's still a work in process. I think it's around 80%. So something that was very important in Spain, I think, was that the first project, the Madrid to Seville, was a complete success from day one. First are never easy, and I think Brian has talked about that before. You are going to face difficulties, you are going to have many issues, and you need very bold managers and very determined stakeholders to go through all these issues and make them happen. And usually after that, things become a little bit easier. It's never easy, but it is. So now I want to review very quickly some things. I don't like so much to talk about lessons learned because every country is different and sometimes it's difficult to extrapolate from one country to the other. But I would like to mention a few things that we think work very well during the deployment of high-speed rail in Spain. So the first topic is around political and funding aspects. And here what I would like to emphasize is first, the clear alignment among all the different stakeholders. Key stakeholders here were the European Union, the government of Spain, the local government, and the civil society. And they were all very much in alignment and determined to make this happen. The European Union played a very relevant role there. Some reasons why they decided to invest in high-speed rail, it's because it's very much aligned with some of their key objectives. So, for instance, CO2 emissions reduction. So they are promoting electrified transportation in order to reduce them. Or another objective was to increase the interoperability and interconnectivity among the different EU members, and high-speed rail was also a very good tool for that. But also, when Spain joined the European Union, I think it was back in 1986, we were very much behind in terms of economic development, in terms of the quality of our infrastructures. And the European Union invested a lot and helped us to catch up with the rest of the European countries. And high-speed rail was instrumental in all that. So in terms of finance, what this political alignment brought was a steady and predictable flow of funds, which was very important. And this has been mentioned before. To know the budget, pluriannual budgets and steady flow of funds allows you first to have a very robust planning, to have a very credible deployment plan. And in Spain, most of the funds came from the public sector, but still this steady and predictable flow of funds allowed also to bring the private sector, mainly in some areas like TODs around the stations or some joint commercial developments. Even one key section that is the interconnection between Spain and France with very complicated tunnels through the Pyrenees was originally conceived as a P3. It's very difficult to build this mega project based on a stop and go system, and having them make some progress as you receive some funds that you never know when they are going to come. That leads to more expensive, more costly, and more lengthy projects. Okay, the second point I want to mention very quickly in terms of things that work well are around some delivery strategies. I've picked up some examples, there could be several others, but for instance, since we had to lay a very large length of tracks, many miles of tracks, the construction companies were able to develop very sophisticated, I would say, means and methods like semi-automatic or almost industrial methods that significantly improved the speed at which the track was laid. So this helped reduce the cost of the projects because it reduced the schedule of the projects. Also, there was a decision to split the whole construction in sometimes smaller packages. Could be in the order of hundreds of millions or even smaller as compared to the billions. So what this allowed was that not only the huge construction groups were able to participate, and they did, and they had a very relevant role, but also smaller local construction companies had a relevant participation. This allowed, on one hand, to increase the competition and so reduce the prices, but also, maybe more important, to lift the wealth and the creation of wealth locally where high-speed rail was being built, so to benefit the local communities. One more thing that I want to mention, which may seem a little bit scary, but has worked very well in Spain, was that the system was conceived from the beginning as a very open system. And what I mean by this is that we have simultaneously circulating in Spain now rolling stock from Siemens, from Alstom, and from Talgo, in combination with systems from both these suppliers and other suppliers. And this may seem scary, and of course needs to rely on a very solid system integration, but it has worked really, really well in Spain. Again, it has allowed to reduce risk and to reduce the cost. And this open concept has been more recently extended to the operation too. Renfe is the classical passenger rail operator in Spain, but more recently we also have SNCF from France and Trenitalia operating through their low cost, in particular in the section between Madrid and Barcelona. The ticket prices have been reduced by about 50%, and the ridership has increased enormously, making high-speed rail even more popular in Spain. And I finish with one more point. We could speak about others, which is around technology. We did not invent high-speed rail. Of course, the Japanese had been there before, but even in Europe, France and Germany were well ahead of us. So when we initiated our program, we decided to import technology from France and Germany in order to reduce the development costs and also to minimize the risk and the errors. But in parallel, at the same time, there was a clear political decision to develop a local industry. So we started step by step. At the beginning, what the Spanish companies were able to do were things like build to print of the rolling stock in Spanish factories, or be more focused on the civil components or providing lower level components. But step by step, with practice and with a clear technology transfer plan, we can say that nowadays we have a very robust rail industry, which with a relevant contribution to the Spanish GDP, to the local GDP. And I leave it here.
I'd now like to invite John Barker to present. John is AECOM's Global Transit Director for Major Projects and High-Speed Rail. He's held senior leadership roles for AECOM at various high-speed rail programs, including Taiwan High-Speed Rail, High-Speed Rail 1 and 2 in the UK, and he's currently supporting the California High-Speed Rail program. He's going to bring a global perspective from those projects to the conversation. He's seen common challenges that all mega projects have and how to address, and he's going to share some of those solutions that have proven effective.
Thank you very much, Harrison. I just wanted to say it's a great pleasure to be here with you all today and just share the passion for high-speed rail with so many industry leaders. It's a very inspiring experience. We've heard today about the appetite around the world, how high-speed rail is increasing. Let me just get this right. Right. And we've heard, we've also heard that there are no one-fits-all solutions. My mandate today, I was given to you when I was asked to speak to you today, was saying, John, can you explain to everybody how we can accelerate high-speed rail and make it go faster? And could you do that in 10 minutes? So here we go. In reality, there are examples of examples of how best practice can be adapted. And just in a snapshot, I'm going to share with you just a few of these examples. And in pulling together these examples, these have been compiled through discussion with industry colleagues and also my own colleagues with AECOM, who I've worked with for many years. And in many cases, this is not just about the why and about the what, which we have heard quite a bit about today, but about the how. And I do think we're going to see some resonating themes. So as with all major projects, successful delivery needs to be conceived on it needs to be based on very well conceived planning. I think we've heard that today. But I'd just like to start with 2 points. And the first point, I think you've probably heard this in several different versions, but in terms of practical application, we can go through it. Funding commitment with the right time investment. And point 2, phasing. Funding commitment with right time investment. It's critical to enable logical and efficient program risk management. And the case for funding needs to be based on an alignment of benefits, stakeholder commitment, technical scope, and robust and affordable envelope. And those need to form a credible baseline for what we want to deliver at any one point in time. Phasing, and this is something I'm very keen on and passionate about. So I think it brings reality to bringing major services and projects into service sooner rather than later. Phasing offers the opportunity to bring forward service benefits in an affordable time frame. And this is especially the case for high-speed rail when we're considering the challenges of entering congested city centres. So what I'd like to do is just share a couple of examples. And there is a reality in my reflection on high-speed rail programs, and maybe it's the programs that I've worked on, particularly in the UK, but these programs often evolve, and it often transpires that services, the way they're brought into service is often different, and the phasing is often different in reality to what was originally planned. And that's partly due to reality. So a quick look at High Speed 1, commonly known as the Channel Tunnel Rail Link, and it provides a high-speed service, a high-speed connection from London to the Channel Tunnel, and is part of the London to Paris and London to Europe connection. In the UK, High Speed 1, it's generally looked on with reflection as a great success. And in many ways, it's seen as a flagship project for the UK. And I've used the service many times. I think it is a great passenger experience. And in many ways, I think we actually take it for granted now. But it really did face many challenges when it was in development. And it was actually planned as a single project from Folkestone to St Pancras to be delivered in one phase. But it encountered very major financial difficulties. And the program actually had to be restructured into a two-phase program. One, to make it more affordable, and two, to make it more manageable. Waterloo Station was remodeled to accommodate a temporary international terminal. And in 2003, Section 1 opened with the trains on the new part of the route on the southern part of the section from Dover to North Kent. And then the trains joined the existing tracks into South London, where they went into Waterloo. 4 years later, the second section to St Pancras was successfully completed. So my industry colleagues from Spain have been very keen to talk to me about Valencia Station. The new route from Madrid into Valencia brings high-speed trains into the centre part of Valencia. But bringing the new trains all the way into the existing mainline station would have been really expensive in a single hit. And this is due partially to spatial constraints and real operational difficulties that would have prevailed. It was therefore decided to build a new temporary station on land which could be made available near to the existing station. The new temporary station is designed to be built from modular, recyclable components, and it can also be designed to be dismantled. So the temporary station is very much part of a long-term master plan, which will include eventual remodeling of the station when funding can be made available. And these are two very different cases, but they highlight how a pragmatic approach to phasing can bring forward service benefits in an affordable way. And it's, in my mind, it's very much the case of realizing the art of the possible. So a simple message about investment at the right time. The risk register for most linear major projects, most linear infrastructure projects, will show land acquisition, utilities, environmental constraints, access, all along the top risks. Well-planned advance works offer the opportunity to manage and mitigate such risks. Advance works themselves, they're often major projects. An early stage investment is needed to secure the time and benefit for these works. So a very simple takeaway: invest at the right time, clear the route, and de-risk the program. I spoke last week to a very senior member of a client team. And he said to me, the best way to accelerate delivery is to get people to work together. In reality, procurement approaches around the world vary greatly. And in many countries, fixed price, hard dollar contracts are still the norm. But in a number of regions, there is a real move towards collaborative approaches. In the UK, for some time, actually target cost models with risk share on pay and gain incentives, they've been used for some time. And although this form of risk share, the application of this form of risk share has varied, the results from this have been somewhat mixed. And there is a recognition and appetite in the industry that to drive further collaboration, and particularly where we've got very complex projects and there's need to integrate the work of a number of contractors. Alliance agreements, where with tailored risk share and incentive to suit target program outcomes. They've been introduced in certain areas and with certain sectors, and have been introduced with good results and improved delivery performance. And these more sophisticated collaborative approaches, they're now being considered, and I think we'll see more of them in the future, for enhancing collaboration across larger programs with multiple contracts. Long linear infrastructure lends itself to standardization and modularization. And this applies especially where we've got long structures and lots of common items which can be procured directly. My first experience of high-speed rail was on the Taiwan high-speed rail project. And the overriding feeling on that project was a project that was really in delivery, and you had to live with the pace of the program. On the Taiwan high-speed line, very high levels of construction productivity were achieved, and they were achieved through standardization and a modular approach to construction. And the design and construction of the major civil works contracts, they were completed in approximately 4 years from the award of construction. And they were very long contracts. This particular contract had over 43 kilometers of standard viaducts and over 60 kilometers of elevated structure in total. And full service was achieved in around about 8 years from the start of the original contracts, the original civil contracts, and that was to full passenger service. A very general and simple message: standardization and modularization. It's safer, it's cheaper, it's faster, it improves quality, and it makes maintenance easier. Finally, final thoughts on program leadership. Program-wide campaigns led by program leadership, they offer an opportunity to drive best practice right throughout the program and through the supply chain of the program, and also to leave a legacy. And in doing so, inevitably to improve overall program performance. And then, for example, program-wide campaigns for health and safety, innovation and quality. These are now becoming common, led by program leadership on major programs. And the purpose is to share knowledge, drive continuous improvement, and measure and improve performance across all of the contracts. And finally, decarbonisation. And just a word on decarbonisation. It's progressing rapidly. It's starting to bring cleaner construction with less exposure to rising energy costs. And on the HS2 programme in the UK, for example, there are now 19 sites which are diesel-free. So that concludes my message. Just reflect on some very simple takeaways from what is really trying to be a simple message. Key takeaways: funding commitment, phasing, collaboration, standardization and modularization, and driving best practice through the supply chain through program leadership. They're all ingredients for success. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, John. We're now going to bring up Terry Hines from our host, Sidley Austin, and Brian Kelly again to talk a little more about this. We heard some, yes? Yeah. So we heard some common themes: standardization, modularization, alignment of incentives, innovation, funding commitment leads to speedier delivery and changed lives. Brian, can you talk a little bit about what you've done since you talked a little bit earlier about this, but what you've done since you took over at California High Speed Rail to accelerate delivery of the program and what's working?
Sure. I mean, I think the first part, as I mentioned earlier, is, we're playing a lot of catch up. So it started with under 19 that we already have underway. It's getting, focusing on getting that project defined because, after there's a lot of changes because of the sequencing of the construction that I talked about earlier, things out of order in the way they started the construction element. You were defining things after contract, which again, a design build, bad idea. So now it's gotten to be about definition on the 119 and then moving that definition to what I would say is accountability and deliverability. But you got to define what you're doing first. And for us, unfortunately, it's a little bit after the fact. The good news for us going forward, though, is pivoting to our next construction contracts, as I said earlier. I think it's about getting the stage of that, the chronology and the stage of the sequencing of that work right, which we are doing. I think I heard Mercedes mention the idea of smaller construction contracts going forward, which we think is a smart thing to do to manage risk a bit more and expand competitiveness on each of our bids. We want to simplify some of those contracts. And so I think you're going to see that coming from us as we go forward. And then in terms of the procurement methodology, which I think the first speaker mentioned, we started in design build only. I've got some board members who candidly never want to see another design build contract. But I don't, I think the reality is there'll be a mix of procurement methods as we go forward. The design bid build will be one for sure. There's variations on the theme of progressive design build versus what's called contract manager, general contractor, CMGC. My view is, and it's only my view, and again, I work for a board, so they may have a different view, but I like the idea of owning more of the design. I like the idea of owning more of the design. And so I think, that's the direction I'd take us in as we go forward. And so those are, some of the things that we're developing and have been developing.
Mike, you press the green light.
Push the button on this, make it green.
Right. Apologies. Just to complement what you've just said, Brian, I think there's the move away from a design and build, which is based on effectively what I would call a lightweight design. I think we're moving away from that in the industry, and I've seen across the HS2 program as they move from phase 1 to phase 2. They're looking for the opportunity for the client and the program leadership team to be able to take better control of the design as it moves through into delivery. Not eliminating design and build, but placing a design risk which the contractors are better placed to manage.
Well, I think for us, as we think about it going forward, all of this stuff goes hand in hand. There's all these elements that must work together. And again, I think the earlier presentation on, you got to have the capacity within the agency to manage these things. And again, that's something that we've been putting more focus on, where I mentioned the sort of move we're making from, percentage of consultants to state staff. That's not an endorsement or a criticism of any one side. It's getting the balance right. But also, if we're going to do procurement differently going forward, we got to make sure that we have the capacity to manage different contracts and more. And so that's an element that we're focused on putting together as well. So it's all these different components all have to work together to execute efficiently, and we're sort of working on each of those as we go.
You talk about making things work together. One of the great catch-22s is we heard a lot about finance this morning, right? We have to find the money to finance these things. And we also heard a lot this morning about trying to speed up the approval process, the environmental review process and so forth. If you get your environmental work done, but you haven't got your financing, when you finally get your financing, especially the opponents of a project will say, oh, your environmental impact study is stale, needs to be supplemented, needs to be looked at again. Okay. And it's kind of a catch-22 that you got to go back to the beginning of the line. And it can be quite frustrating. So it's difficult though, when you don't know where your source of financing is, to coordinate the environmental review process and the process of having the dollars to proceed right away. We need to figure out a way to coordinate that better.
Here. No, I mean, just again, in our case, we're unique in a lot of ways, but one of the things you know, the original federal funding that we received required two deliverables from us. One, get the 119-mile segment done, which we're going to do, and we're going to phase it that way because we can afford to get that done. But it's also true that that segment alone is not enough from an operational perspective. We got to do more. So we have to find some additional funds to do more. The other element that we have to get done under our original federal agreement is that environmental clearance I talked about earlier. We have to complete all of it from San Francisco to Anaheim. It's part of our federal agreement. Now, I kind of like that we have that pressure on us, even though you're right, all the financing is in order. But I'm a big believer, and I've learned this again the hard way. I want great project definition. So I really like the idea of us finishing this environmental work, advancing the design work forward. Let's have a conversation about funding as we go. But I think, you know, with the ability to know exactly what this footprint's going to look like, what these cost issues are going to be, what it's going to take to move the right of way and the utilities, get all of that done. Getting that all squared away as we have the next funding conversation in California, I think is a better conversation for us as we're trying to get to more populated areas.
Let me ask you a question. During your earlier presentation, you were talking about, funding based on dollars spent, like you have to go ahead and spend the dollars. How about a funding regime that rewards you based on miles completed? And what I'm thinking about is, for those of you here this morning, I talked about the Transcontinental Railroad and the way those bonds worked that Congress authorized the railroads to issue was every time they built more miles toward the Golden Spike in Promontory, Utah, they got to issue more bonds.
If you asked me that question when I first started on this project, I would have been opposed because we were not defined enough. But now that we are, that's a challenge I would take on. But I would not have on day one.
We've heard a lot about best practices, but what are some of the things that a project sponsor can do to actually drive those into the project team so that there's a culture of excellence that emerges? Anybody who wants to take that? Mercedes, John, Eric?
Yeah, I think, or at least from the research that I've done, again, on transit projects, it's about the capacity and bringing in people that know what they're doing. So I've been working on a project in Seattle with Sound Transit, who has one of the largest capital expansion programs of any transit agency. And at the head of their capital program are people who've never delivered a light rail project, right? And so you can imagine how that creates problems. So yeah, you need to bring in people who know what they're doing. And I think once you have some successes, right, it breeds confidence and sort of the board gets on board and they stop being a pain in your butt. And then the staff below you is also like, you know what we're doing, and you get going. I think if you are sort of mired and saddled with sort of, delays and overruns, it has to be, I mean, again, I'm a professor, I don't work, but it has to be demoralizing, right? And no one's happy about it. And you're just sort of going through the motions. So I think, whatever you can do to get some successes and bring in people who know what they're doing and hand them the reins, let them say, in Spain, we did this, it doesn't work like that here. Let's figure out a way to make it work like that. Because I think it's a great model. And some of the decision-making processes that they have there, some of the funding mechanisms they have there, maybe those are the types of things we should be sort of adapting.
I want to open it up to questions. I'm going to ask one more quick one. Mercedes, you mentioned that development of high-speed rail in Spain changed lives, changed the economies locally in small towns. What are some of the benefits that came from the development of the high-speed railroad?
Well, we have been discussing many, of course, air quality. I think it's more aligned with how millennials think in terms of traveling, in terms of environment and things like that. But I would say, and I think that Congressman Moulton mentioned that this morning, that the main effect is when you have the network and when you extend that. In Spain, what happened, I think, is that high-speed rail was able to structure, Spain is the size of California in terms of extension and population and things like that. So maybe we are a small case as compared to what would be the US, and it's more difficult to extrapolate. But it kind of brought the cities closer, and things happen. Of course, at the beginning, we started pairing the big cities, but more and more we included the medium and the small ones. I was born in León, which is a tiny city north of Spain. And since we have high-speed rail, you can see the economy booming and great development. You include everyone in that development.
How do you manage that without having a stop in every single town that wants the train to stop? Kind of hard to have a high-speed train.
That's that's a tough that's a tough compromise. It's usually what makes sense, because if you stop everywhere, it's not high speed rail any longer.
Yeah.
So that's
take
the
it.
difficult equation.
Questions from the room? Yes, sir.
I look at, again, I don't have a magical number, but the issue is, again, knowing enough about what's in front of you and defining it further. And that's what we're after. I mean, when the High Speed Rail Authority awarded the initial construction contract, you know, the design was still at the environmental stage. You know, we're not doing that again. We're not doing that again. So, and I want to get a lot of things out of the way before you can do that. So I think the strategy that we have in place right now is bring this to something like 30+%, understand what's in front of us, then talk to my board about what procurement options they want to do and what kind of recommendations might we make depending on what that contract is for. You know, is it a station? Is it a structure? Is it more, you know, what procurement works best? And so initially it's about just defining what's in front of us, getting those actions out of the way, and then getting to a procurement model that makes sense.
Questions? Please.
Yeah, I had a question for Eric. In your research, I was curious along the theme of everything that we've been talking about that process of environmental permitting and clearance to actually build the projects that we want to build. It's time intensive, it's costly. Have you tried to evaluate and isolate the cost to getting to shovel ready in the US compared to other countries around the world?
Yeah, so we have tried. I say a couple different things. So with transit projects, agencies do it differently around the country. So I mentioned Seattle. They had a ballot initiative that fast-tracked this ST3 program, $54 billion. They started all of their environmental work then, right? In New York and LA, they do a little bit more long-term planning where they do some of that alternative analysis before you enter into the federal process. So they don't come with 47 different alternatives that they have to investigate, which they do in Seattle. And they only come with, 3 to 4 to 5, and they can get through the NEPA process a bit quicker. The permitting piece that I'm most interested in is the local permitting, the interlocal piece. Your DOTs need to give you a permit to shut down, do construction on the street. You need to get, city of XYZ to give you a permit to build a station because they never had a station before. So how do you get a certificate of occupancy? I think that is the area that is sort of ripest for standardization and looking more closely at. Because I think people are very focused on NEPA, and sure, but they got environmental regulations in Europe and in Spain. In Turkey, what we found is if you're building a rail project, you can get a waiver that takes, I think, 3 to 6 months to get, rather than going through the full process. And so that is obviously, on the order of like a categorical exclusion, which you couldn't get for a rail project here. So in terms of quantifying the actual dollars, I don't have a good number for you at the moment, but I have examples from projects, and we can talk more about it, but I don't want to bore everyone. Sure.
The process, it's not just the process. Like Terry mentioned, it's also the fact that it's beholden to the whole funding. And if you get enough political opposition associated with the NEPA process, it can put projects into kind of a tailspin.
Absolutely.
As far as them to kind of go back to the beginning in order to press rights. It would be really interesting to see future ideas of those costs in the United States.
I just want, we had such a unique CEQA experience because on ours, it's both, as I said, it's both the California Environmental Quality Act process and the NEPA process, 2 separate, pretty intensive processes. I have a number that's, people are gonna go, really? But for the environmental work for that whole 500-mile segment, again, a 500-mile segment, unusually large, right? And going through all parts of California, coastal, inland, mountain, flat, everything. We're gonna have spent 1.3 billion on just the environmental. That's no steel in the ground, that's no concrete. That's a staggering figure, but it's also for the percentage of the overall cost of the project, it's about what it is for transit or highway projects in California in terms of that percentage. So, yeah, so, and an interesting thing for us, just these processes are intense. There's a lot of conversation. It's deliberative. It takes a long time. It's not cheap. But in our case, I mean, again, everything about the beginning of ours is so unique. But I would just say that we had a period of time where the environmental documents were not moving very quickly. And we became irrelevant in those communities. And when we got back on, we got to get this thing done and this thing defined. We had to work with those communities on impacts and mitigation. We became very relevant again in those communities. So it was a bit of a two-edged sword. I mean, you got to go through that work to plan and prepare for the project and get to the next phase. But the upside for us is we got a lot more stakeholder involvement and engagement, and it was worth it. So it's painful, but it was good for us. And the other part that there's a whole new seminar on this, I'm sure, but CEQA's litigation heavy, and there's elements of that perhaps someday we can talk more about.
Jim.
Please.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was that paper plus mitigations? Or was that paper?
It's analysis, reports,
Sure.
paper. The mitigation is much higher.
That's what I was
Much
curious
higher.
about.
Yeah, because some of our mitigations are physical, right? We're building something different than we were at the beginning. You know, this bridge is not going there, it's going there. We're going to avoid that lake. You know, that avoidance is $500 million. You know, so the mitigation is not in that thing.
Yes, please.
You mentioned the higher costs of stop go in phase project. So especially in California, which is about 2 more phases to go, are you thinking or are you able to try and quantify the cost of stopping? And do you think that communicating that decision makers can help avoid the stop go scenario? I remember your presentation said it was around 2030. So you need to know.
Well, so for everything that we want to be operating by 2030, the environmental work is done. We got to, as I said, we're finishing design work now on the extensions to go from 119 to 171. We need to know, and I said this earlier, I have to know in 2023 whether or not I have a federal partner on this project. If I do not, I'm building a 119-mile test track and waiting. Or I'm building an operational segment. But I have to know in 2023 whether we have a partner. And our application has 2 elements to it. One, a current year application for funding, so we can get some specific things done. And then seeking a multi-year commitment for partnership over 5 years. And if those get answered in the positive, we're going to keep going. If those don't get answered in the positive, we're going to do the work that we owe the federal government now, and we're going to wait. We're going to wait, and I don't want to be there. I don't want to be there, but that's kind of as stark as it looks.
Got time for one more, please.
Thank you. Andrea Giuricin from Italy. We saw the example also in Spain that is very, very interesting. And also is interesting that right now you have a private operator like IRIO that is coming also from aviation sector and investment sector, but also from my country, we have the first experience of high-speed rail with a private operator. Not managing infrastructure, but as a railway undertaking. Is there any possibility that maybe also in California and other US projects that maybe not for the infrastructure to attract private investor, but in terms of buy rolling stock, for example, the typical example, IRIO bought 20 trains, high-speed rail, Italo bought 51 high-speed train set. That is possible, these kind of things, or?
Yeah, so for us, we have two kind of business models that are going to come into play. Initially, when we build the 172 miles, we're going to own the infrastructure and the trains. An operator will be by contract, and it might be a public sector entity and it might be a private sector entity. And so that's still to come on the operating side. As we expand beyond that, we'll be operators directly as we get out of the valley into the Bay Area and LA. But again, we'll be looking for, is it us or are we operating contractually through another public or private sector operator? And that's still in front of us. That's still a decision to be made. But yeah, I'm hoping that option is in front of us.
Okay, well, thank you, panel. As I mentioned at the top, I think we're putting together a report on best practices from around the world and how to bring them to the United States. So stay tuned for that later this year. And thanks again.
Thank you.